Good morning, everyone. My name is Gavin Shepheard, and this is Peter Marshall, and we're from a company called Commerce Decisions. Sounds like the start of Dragon's Den, but it's not, I know that. So we're here today to help you think differently around how you plan for an evaluation or a procurement evaluation. We've been in business for 20 plus years now. Both Peter and I have worked together for most of that time. And so we were established in 2001. We've delivered over 15,000 projects. We have software and services. And so what we'd like to concentrate on today is talking you through some of the services we're able to offer. And we're known in the marketplace as being mildly disruptive to enable people to think differently when it comes to planning for a complex procurement. I've got a short video that tells you a little bit more of our story, and then I'll just hand over to Pete. So when we talk about complex procurement, what we like to identify, quite often clients and prospects always think about the monetary value of a procurement being complex. And what we find in the marketplace, it's not always the value that's being spent, it's the impact of the decision that's being made. And no more time is apparent than now with decisions that need to be made at short notice, with the repercussions being managed carefully. So what we find is a lot of clients pigeonhole the services that we offer into the high impact, high price category, but more often than not, we end up in these two categories here. So that's what Pete's going to start talking to you about today. We're not really that interested in helping you buy your toilet rolls or your pens and paper very effectively. That's not what we're about. We're talking the more complex type of procurement that requires lots of different stakeholders making value-based decisions on information that's shared from the marketplace. So we kind of want you to open your minds a little bit to think slightly differently. The considerations, and these are the types of things that pop up when we're engaging with customers, the things that they need to consider: political will to improve, suffered from a high profile challenge, they're developing their procurement policies, they're maturing their use of technology. We learned very early on, 2 years into Commerce Decisions, that having the best tech did not make the decision any better. It was the strategic thinking that went into the tech that made the importance, and that's what Pete's going to talk you through. So we work across the global marketplace, and that's important because a lot of the messages that we're able to give when we do these talks across the globe is we pick and choose the bits of information that we've learned from the different sectors that we operate in, take the best of those and push them back out into the marketplace to try and make the outcomes better for everyone. So in polling our customers, we do a survey every year with our customers, and we ask them what's most important at the moment. So this one was taken back in April, actually. So you can imagine over the last 12 months, there's been an additional number of changes, but the size of the block indicates the amount of feedback we've had from the people that we polled. Social value now would probably be the largest block, but value for money comes out really strongly in a lot of people that we engage with. So with that in mind, I'm just going to pass you over to Pete now to talk you through the rest of the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm Peter Marshall, founder and principal consultant with Commerce Decisions. So I'm here to talk about weighting with impact. I hope by the end of this I'll have described to you a sort of proactive and objective approach to weighting evaluation criteria. But before we get into that, let's just explore, why is weighting important? Well, of course, we all know instinctively the weighting is going to determine the balance between the major areas of our evaluation. So most evaluations that we run, they're going to be a combination of capability. We're going to look at cost. We're going to look at maybe social value. We're going to look at things like risk. And of course, we all know instinctively that the weighting is going to determine the way in which they interact and the emphasis of one over the other. So it essentially answers the question, how much are we willing to pay for capability? How much social value are we willing to, or do we want to get for a certain amount of additional cost? Are we willing to even trade off capability for social value and things like that? So that's instinctive, isn't it? But weighting does two other things as well, because it also determines what solutions we're going to be offered by our bidders. So I've worked for bidders in the past, and I can remember one job in particular a while ago where I helped a bidder make a decision about whether to propose so what was being bought was a sort of VIP helicopter service. And the bidder was trying to choose between offering a single helicopter, which was quite a low-cost solution, but was not particularly available because it had to be withdrawn from service every now and again to be serviced and what have you. The alternative they were looking at was a two-helicopter solution, more expensive but more available, because obviously you had one always in service. And so that was a decision being made by the bidder, and it was determined by the weight. So your weights will determine what solutions you are offered in the first place. And even more than that, it will sometimes make the difference between a bidder choosing to bid and not bid. So again, in my experience, I've got examples of competitions. In my head, I've got a competition I've worked on fairly recently where we started with 5 sort of down-selected bidders, and by the time we actually got to publish the RFP, there were only 2 left in the race. 3 of them had become aware of the weights as they were being refined down and had withdrawn from the competition, simply because they see that they didn't have a viable way of winning. So your weights are really important. I'm going to be talking about weighting at 2 levels, well, everywhere really in the hierarchy. So what I'm going to say is relevant at the very top of the hierarchy, where we're dealing with things like cost and capability, risk, social value, right down to the bottom of the hierarchy, where we're weighting individual criteria. So it's relevant to all of those levels. Now, the first thing I want to sort of explore is that, it kind of goes without saying, it's obvious that depending upon the weights we come up with, those weights will have an effect. It will favour one thing over another. It will cause a bidder to offer a 2 helicopter solution rather than a 1 helicopter solution. It will cause, if I'm buying a car and some things are more important to me, I'll end up with an SUV. If something else is important to me, I might end up with a hatchback or something. That's obvious. So we've got a choice here. We can either use what I think of as traditional approach, which is what I think most people do, which is to come up with some weights through various processes, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. And then after we've come up with some candidate weights, kind of go, well, what effect do they have? What are they going to do? So we can do sensitivity analysis on those weights to work out, do they do what we want them to do? And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So we might go back and change the weights. And so it becomes an iterative process. But of course, if we're going to ask the question, do these weights work? Are they doing what we want them to do? You have to know what you want them to do. So to answer that question, you have actually got to sit down and work out what effect do we want the weights to have. You can't decide the weights are correct without knowing what you want them to do. So normally you end up sort of defining the weights and doing effects, and then this iterative process. Now there is an alternative, which is we do it backwards. We start by working out what effect we want the weights to have, and then we calculate the weights. We just do some maths to work out what weights we need to put in place in order to get that effect that we want. And it's these 2 alternatives that I'm going to be going through very quickly and giving you a feel for how they can actually work. So the big advantage of doing it the bottom way is that it's a lot less iterative. If we define the effect we want, then we just work out the weights that make that work. the chances are, well, there's a much greater chance that it works first time. And I personally think of that as a more proactive approach. Excuse me. Okay, so first of all, some issues that we need to think about when we're waiting at the very, very top of the tree. So when we're at the top of the hierarchy, we're weighting things like cost against social value, capability and risk and things like that. And there's a lot to think about here. I'm going to scratch the surface because I haven't got long. But so the first thing is, what do we know about what the solutions are going to cost? Have we got a good idea of what it's going to cost to meet our requirement? Because if we've got a really solid understanding of the cost of what we're buying, what we could do is we could set a mandatory limit for the cost and say, if you're more than X million pounds, you're non-compliant, you're out of the competition. And by doing that, that provides a rock solid way of preventing unaffordable solutions from winning our competition. Nobody's going to bid over that amount because they know they'll be non-compliant. So that works really well if we know what the cost is and we've got a realistic idea of cost and we're willing to publish it and enforce it. But that comes with risks. One risk is we haven't got a good enough understanding of what the cost is going to be. And so if we publish something that's not right, well, first of all, there's a danger that all the bidders have to degrade their solutions to fit within the costs that we've published. And that could be unexpected for us. I guess the worst outcome is bidders aren't able to even meet the minimum mandatory criteria and they withdraw from the competition. So we don't get any bids that are compliant and our competition collapses. So there's a real danger in that approach, or there's various risks and dangers in that approach. And for that reason, sometimes people don't want to publish a hard limit to the cost. But if we're not going to do that, how do we prevent very, very expensive bids from winning our competition? Well, the answer is, of course, we put enough weight. We think about how we're scoring cost and how we're weighting cost to make sure a very expensive solution can't win because it's lost lots of points. But depending upon, there's lots and lots of ways that we can do this, right? So one way we can do it is we can have a cost criteria with a weight, and that's fairly traditional. So say 40% weight for cost. But if you think about it, if there's only 40 points for cost and there's 60 points for everything else, it's possible that someone could establish a more than 40-point lead. And then when it comes to cost, they're still going to win the competition regardless how expensive they are. Okay, so there's a lot to think about here. So the point I want to make on this slide is when you're weighting, particularly at the top and cost, you have to do it whilst at the same time considering things like how are we evaluating cost, and how are we going to combine the evaluation of cost with everything else? And you've got to answer some of the questions on the slide, like what risk are you willing to take? Can you afford for your competition to collapse? There's quite a lot we need to think about when we're waiting at the bottom of the hierarchy as well. The nature and the volume of the criteria. So the more criteria there are, some of the methods work better and some work worse. So there are some methods at the bottom of the slide, which I'll go through very quickly. But so, for example, if we've got a lot of criteria, we wouldn't be able to use pairwise comparison as a weighting method. It's just not scalable, it doesn't work. We need to establish a basis of comparison as well. This is really, really important. So if we're going to weight our criteria, we need to know the basis on which we're doing that. Now, something that's really obvious is that, the extent to which each of the criteria is going to contribute towards meeting our requirement or our overall objective is a really obvious one. And that's going to be a fairly major basis. But we've also probably got to think about things like the degree to which the criteria are going to differentiate between the bidders as well. And other things as well. So there's a methodology that we use, which is called Commerce Decisions 4-Factor, which has 4 separate things that we look at when we're deciding how to weight criteria. One of them is its importance to meeting the requirement. Another one is differentiation, and there are others as well. So it's really, really important we think about on what basis we're weighting criteria. We need to think about the stakeholders and their sort of what I call the homogeneity of them. Are they all the same? Are they going to agree? Have they all got a similar viewpoint? Or is there going to be a lot of conflict? Are they coming at it from a very different approach? So, if, for example, we are trying to weight criteria where, cost versus social value, we're likely to have very, very different stakeholders in the room to make that decision. and they might not agree with each other. And so we've got to think about the method we're going to use that's going to sort of de-stress that and make it objective as possible. So there are a whole load of methods that we can use for weighting very, very quickly. So gut instinct is probably the most common, literally just sitting in a room going, well, I think that should have 30%, and that should have 20%, not really thinking about the effect it has. A relative or scaled mechanism, which is where you kind of pick one weight and you say, well, let's give that 100 points, and then let's give everything else a weight relative to it. So this is a bit more important than that one, we'll give it 150 points. This is a bit less important, we'll give it 30, and so on. Pairwise comparison is a very, very objective way of weighting things. You get fantastically good, robust weights, but it takes a lot of time, and basically it's not scalable. It works by comparing every criteria with every other criteria. So if you think about it, if you've got something like 10 criteria, you have to do 9 plus 8 plus 7 plus 6 comparisons, and it's a lot of work. So it works on very small sets of criteria. Our method, which has 4 factors, and the outcome-driven approach that I'm talking about as well. So lots of methods to choose between, and we need to think about which method is appropriate. Okay, and some considerations that we need to think about when we're weighting at any level. Again, I mean, I could spend an hour on this alone, but we need to be aware that nearly always there's going to be some level of precedence or expectation that we've got to fit within. I've worked on projects where right from the get-go, you've got stakeholders saying, my criteria has to be weighted between 10 or 20%. It's just what we've always done. I'm not going to live with anything else. I've seen this, and often it's driven by more what, as an external observer, it looks like it's more driven by kind of, turf war, if you like, rather than an objective, measure of what weight do we need to give it in order for this thing to have the effect we want. And we need to be aware that when we're weighting, we're dealing with stakeholders. So we've got all the, the bias and conformity and emotion to think about as well. I'm not going to talk about this now. You just have to go away and Google it. But conformity, we know that if we put a load of people in the room and, ask them in order what they think, by the time you get to the last person, they're not going to give you the same view that they would have given you if you'd asked them first. They will be influenced by the people who come before them. So we need to think about all of these issues when we're designing the mechanism for engaging with our stakeholders and getting their sort of opinions from it. So I want to sort of start drawing this around to talking about how can we use a proactive and objective approach to weighting. Well, the first thing we can do is we can prepare. We can make sure we've done the upfront work to get the preparation right. The first thing is we need to have the criteria developed. We can't weight things that are still being developed, ideally. So we need to know what the criteria are. We need to know how we're scoring them. We need to know which of the criteria are mandatory or compliance criteria. They're not being weighted. You have to do those. The only things we're going to weight are the criteria that are rated or scored. So we need to know which of they are. We need to be really, really careful about not having too many mandatory criteria, because we know that if we have too many, it gets very difficult for everyone to be compliant. Our competition's at risk of collapsing. We may end up paying, we reduce all the flexibility for bidders. So we get the criteria right. And then we also think very carefully about who are the stakeholders that need to be involved in the weighting process. Where are they coming from? Who do they represent? What are the constraints we're working with? Do we have to keep the weight of something less than 20 or more than 20? Or, what are those expectations and constraints? We need to be really clear on what the high-level objectives of our procurement are. So we can't wait. Again, the basis of comparison is going to have to be things like, to what extent does this support the objectives of our procurement? So we need to have them defined, really, and clearly agreed and defined. And ideally, we need to think about what risks we've got. So, for example, if we've got an incumbent supplier and there's a real risk they can lock all of their competitors out of the competition somehow, we need to consider that as part of the weighting process. Make sure we don't weight things in such a way as to make it easy for them to win the competition, if that's appropriate. So then, if we're doing the sort of the traditional way of doing things, well, we'd follow an approach which is to come up with some initial weights. So we'd choose one of the weighting methodologies that I briefly talked about earlier. We'd sort of run workshops, we'd send out questionnaires, we'd go through the process that we thought through. We'd collect all the views from the stakeholders, we'd do some maths on it, derive some candidate weights, and do some sensitivity analysis on it on the right. work out a sensitivity analysis, basically saying, do the weights do what I want them to do? And of course, that's going to be iterative. Probably the first time we're going to go, they don't quite work. We'll have to change the weights a little bit. And so you go back and forth between the two until you get to a point where you go, no, I'm confident the weights now have the effect I want them to have. The objectives are being met. And I'll talk about that in the next slide or two. Alternatively, we can do it the other way around. We can start by defining the objectives that were the outcome that we're trying to do. And I'll show you that in a minute. We can talk about the outcomes, the objectives we want, and then we can calculate the weights from it. So the key thing about this, whichever way we do it, doesn't matter whether we're doing it the forwards way or the backwards way, we have to know, are the weights doing what we want them to do? So and a really good way of doing that is using what I call scenarios. Okay, and that's what I'm going to sort of focus on now, is how can we define some scenarios that tell us the weights are working or not, whichever way we're doing it. So I did promise my colleagues I'd try and keep the number of graphs in this to a minimum, but I do need one or two, so bear with me if you don't mind. So I want you to imagine for a minute we're running a competition. So in the top right hand corner here, we're running a competition where we have cost as a criteria with 40% of the marks, and everything else, so technical, social value, quality, has the other 60% of the marks. And the way that we're evaluating cost is we're using the formula up there. We're giving the cheapest bid top marks, and if you're, say, twice as expensive, you get half the marks. So it's kind of, proportional scoring of cost. Right. On the graph on the left, this lower blue dot is representing a solution that costs 50 million and gets a score, a quality or technical score of 30%. That's all it means, okay? So it's a fairly cheap and cheerful solution. And we could work out what that scores, right? I mean, it gets all the marks for cost, because let's assume it's the cheapest. It gets all the marks for cost, so it's got 40% for cost, and it's got 30% of the 60% for technical, so it's got another 18%. So its overall score is 58%, right? Now, of course, there's lots of other ways that you can get 58%, and this is one of them here. So this solution here is twice as expensive. It's 100 million, so it's twice as expensive. So it's lost half the marks for cost, which is 20 marks. But if its quality score goes up by 1/3, it gains those back again. If it gets back 1/3 of the 60, it's got the 20 points back. So this solution scores the same as that solution. And this solution up here also scores the same. So you can see that there's, on this chart, 3 solutions that all score the same score of 58 points. And that's what the blue line represents. The blue line represents the score of 58. The grey lines represent other scores. I don't know what they are, but other scores. So you can think of this as like contours on a map, okay, where the scores are the height of the land. And of course, the best place to be on our map, the highest ground, if you like, is going to be in the top left-hand corner, because up there you've got very cheap and very good solutions. The worst place to be on our map is down here, which is very expensive and very poor. So this is a map with contours on it, and we can see that these 3 all score the same. Now, on this diagram, we've got 3 solutions that don't score the same. We've got the blue one, I think that was one of the ones we just looked at. We've got a green solution, which is a worse solution. So it's more expensive. It's a bit better in terms of quality or technical, but it's a lot more expensive. It's twice the cost. And we can see, because the green line is underneath the blue line, we can see that it scores a lower score. It's on lower ground on our map. And the red or orange solution is a really expensive solution. It's, what is it? It's 5 times the cost. But it's very, very high score for capability or technical. But it wins. It's the best of the 3. It's got the highest score. Its score line is on the highest ground on the map. Okay? And so this diagram is telling us that if we use this methodology, these weights and this methodology, the orange one will win. And so we can start to ask ourselves the question, is that what we want? Is that the effect that we want? Are we happy to pay 5 times as much for a really good solution when we could pay, or are we happy to pay 250 million for a really good solution when we could pay 100 million for a okay solution? We can ask that question. I'm not going to presuppose what the answer is, but that's the technique we can use. Now, of course, in practice, there wouldn't just be 3 possible scenarios that we'd look at. So the way that we can actually apply this is we can look at we can look at a number of scenarios. So the diagram on the right is showing what we could do if we wanted to test our weights and our methodologies. We could just come up with, say, 5 scenarios for cost, which are the 5 columns there, 50 million, 100 million, 150, and so on. We could also come up with 4 scenarios for quality, which are the horizontal lines, so 30, 50, 70, and 90% scores. And we can combine them. So each of those dots is a scenario, a combined scenario, a hypothetical solution that's got a specific cost and a specific quality score. Okay, and what we can do, if we're going one way, is we can say, if we use these weights, and if we use this way of scoring cost, then the order that they will be ranked in is as per the numbering on the slide. So obviously the best one is number 1 up there because it's nearer the top left-hand corner. It's giving the most capability for the least cost. But then after that, you've got number 2 is better than number 3, which is better than number 4, which is better than number 5, which is better than number 6, better than, and so on. So you can see the order in which they come out. And we can, again, ask the question, are we happy with that? Do they come out in a sensible order? That's the effect. And so we can just simply say, is the effect there? Are we happy with it? And of course, we can do the same thing. I mean, the example I just gave had cost in it. In fact, just going back, I should just point out the reason why the lines on the left over there are curved is because the way that we're scoring cost is not linear. So the shape of these lines and where the contours go, the shape of them and the steepness and the angle and everything is going to be determined by a whole load of things, including the weights that we apply, but also the way that we're scoring costs. So on this slide, I'm just showing how we can also apply the same thing to any criteria within our hierarchy. So we could come down towards the bottom of our hierarchy and we could pick 2 things out and we could say, well, let's make sure let's get the weighting between these things right. Again, so that they trade off with each other in an appropriate way. So the example I've chosen here was capability and delivery risk. So imagine we're buying a bit of kit. Capability is, what does it do? How good is it? How well is it going to work? Delivery risk is, are we going to get it in operation quick enough? Perhaps we're buying something that needs to be, urgently acquired and put into use. And there's a real, we know that, that there's the option for bidders to take an off-the-shelf bit of equipment, which requires kind of no engineering. They could just say, well, it's off the shelf. There you go. We can start manufacturing it immediately. So there's very little risk associated with offering you that capability. Or alternatively, they could try and do a whole load of engineering modifications to it, which require work, and then they've got to rejig the production line or something. So there's a whole load of risk in getting the thing engineered and then manufactured quick enough. So that might be the sort of competition we're running. In which case, we'll want to make sure that we've got those 2 things, that balance right. We don't want to end up with a fantastic solution in theory that never arrives. Equally, we don't want to only necessarily choose the thing that's off the shelf and immediately right now if it's not going to do what we want. So again, we can trade these 2 things off. And the principle is exactly the same. We can come up with a weight. Let's say they weight 60-40 or something like that. We can work out effectively. We can use the same score lines on our chart. We can have a number of hypothetical scenarios. And we can say, is the effect we're getting from this right? Are they coming out in the correct order? So on this chart, of course, the best place to be is the top right-hand corner because you've got the best capability and the best score for delivery risk, which means the lowest level of risk. It's a bit counterintuitive there. So the lower the risk, the higher the score. So obviously the best place to be is up here. So the best solution on this diagram is number 1. And we can say, well, are we happy that we'd choose 2 before 3 and 3 before 4 and so on? So we can come up with some weights, we can do something like this, and we can run some workshops, and we can say, are they coming out in the right order? Are we getting the correct effect? Alternatively, we can try and do this whole thing in reverse, the more proactive approach that I'm thinking of. So what I've got on this chart are some scenarios. Okay, I've thinned them out a bit because we don't need to do that whole matrix. Some of those scenarios just might be completely implausible. There's no way someone can offer a fantastic solution with no engineering work or something like that. I don't know. So we might have looked at what the criteria are, looked at the combinations and said, no, that's just impossible. It's against the laws of physics, can't be done. Let's ignore it. So, of course, what we're going to focus on are the most likely, most feasible possible solutions. And that's the first point I'm trying to make on the chart. And what we can then do is say, well, there's some stuff on here that's really obvious. And apologies, there is a mistake on this chart. So the first thing we can do is we can say, well, look, solution A has to be worse than solution B because it's got a poorer capability and the same delivery risk. So A is definitely not as good as B, and B is definitely not as good as C, and so on. D is definitely not as good as E, and so on. Yeah? We can see that. We don't need to ask the question, do we want one to win? So some of these things are not of interest. We rule them out, and the mistake is up here because A should be less than B and B should be less than C. Okay. So there's some things on the chart that we just know. What is of interest is to ask the question, well, hang on, is A better or worse than E? We're trading off here. A and E, one's got better delivery risk, one's got better capability. Well, which is the best? Are we trading them off in the right way? So that is of interest. And what we can do is we can go through a mechanism of asking our stakeholders, would you prefer, for example, would you prefer B over H? Let's think it through. Let's work out what these two solutions are. Let's talk it through, but come up with a decision. We think, for example, we think H is better than B. And we also think that C is better than H. So you can imagine how we would run through a process like that in some sort of workshop or something like that. Now, I'm not going to explain there's a sort of mathematical notation on the left, which I'm not going to explain now. But if you want to understand that, come and find me afterwards, and I'm happy to go through it. But essentially, we can collect these comparisons, which says which of these do we prefer over which others, and essentially go through a mathematical process of simply working out what the weights need to be in order to satisfy these preferences. So the weight, effectively, the effect of the weight is to have a different gradient on these score lines. Again, I won't go through the maths. So you can imagine, the best solutions are in the top right here. You can imagine if you make those lines steeper, they come out in one order, and if you make the lines shallower, they all come out in a different order. So you can sort of feel instinctively, you can work the lines to get the outcome you want. So this is the other approach, okay? If we want to, what we can do is we can start by understanding the effect we want our weights to have, collected in the form of these sorts of preferences, which are based upon scenarios that we generate in advance. And then we just do the maths to work out what the weights have to be. This isn't a one-off thing. This is something we do at various levels. We sort of build up from the bottom of the hierarchy, and you do stuff at the bottom, and you build up in bits and build the picture up. Okay, so I just want to bring this together, give you a few takeaways. I'm going to hand over briefly to Gavin. So hopefully what you've heard is that the weights are really critical to your competition. Okay, really you need to start thinking about how you're going to do this up front. Don't leave it to the end, do it up front. That's the proactive part of it. Make sure, part of getting your weights right, make sure you think about how you're scoring cost, how you're combining cost with everything else. We can think the mechanisms we can use to check the weights are working is we can use real scenarios. We want to make them as tangible as possible, make them real, not just numbers, but try and make them real, bring them to life, make them realistic, and make them cover the range of possible outcomes. we can make sure that up front we're identifying the constraints, any constraints or expectations we're working within. That's really important. The number of times I've been through this and you get derailed right at the end by someone saying, well, we can't, that's got to be weighted 10%. That's what we always do. And you've got to start that discussion early if you've got any chance of countering it. And the most important thing, the proactive part of this is starting early, making time to start it early. I'll leave you just with one thought, which is the point at which we actually decide who's going to win our competition is not once the bids have come back and we've evaluated them. It's when we've actually designed our criteria up front. So when we publish our ITN or ITT or RFP with the weights in it, we've already decided who is going to win the competition. We don't know the name yet, but we've decided because we've published the weights. All that happens when the bids come back is we turn the handle on the machine and out spits the winner's name. So it's really important we design that well up front. I'm going to hand back over to my colleague, Gavin.
Okay, thanks, Pete. So just to pull that all together, one of the things that we historically got accused of is being very ethereal and very clever at coming up with some of this thinking, but how do we turn that into practical, deliverable solutions? So what we've been doing over the last 5 years is actually developing the ability of some of the thought leadership that Pete's got into our software product award to help people time to value in terms of, and it's called converged SaaS packages, where you're able to combine the thought leadership with some technology. The other aspect that we're able to get the thought leadership into the wider sphere and kind of trying to help clients get to the best possible outcome is through our masterclass training. So we have masterclass training courses that encapsulate all the other elements of our sort of thought leadership, particularly when it comes to, and they've been delivered from Canada Post to the New Zealand Navy, all clients doing different types of procurement projects. And the very last thing I'd say is, if you don't follow us on LinkedIn, please do follow us on LinkedIn, because there's loads of white papers and Pete's brain out on white papers thinking about this stuff in a really clever and digestible way. So follow the link. We've got an expert impact blog that Pete started to do, and it's got quite good readership already. So that's all we'd like to say. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, we'll be more than happy to take them. We'll be staying around, so feel free to come and speak to us. Thank you very much.